Hello. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. It is my pleasure to welcome you again to a very exciting week. Today, we are starting a new series of workshops or webinars, and we're going to start with a very interesting topic. I really appreciate your time and your attention. So well, let's start. My Abdel Jacobo. I'm the academic specialist for University of Dayton Publishing in Mexico, and I'm very pleased to coordinate and organize this series of webinars with our specialists and our consultants, which are experts on the topics they are presenting. And talking about that, I'm going to present our speaker today, which is Isaac Perez Volado. He's going to talk about assessment online. Since you are very interested on working online and planning and providing feedback to your students through distance, because we understand that this is the time in which you want to learn how to work online with your students. So let me introduce Isaac Perez Volado. University of Texas at El Paso. He got his BA, University of Buckingham, PGCE, and Master in Education. He holds also a Cambridge CELTA TKT and Train the Trainer. He's a teacher, trainer, and writer working in bilingual education and ELT. He has experience in the classroom and also as a program head and academic consultant. His main interests include educational technology, applied linguistics, and cognitive science. He currently lives in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, where he teaches art in international school. So Isaac is ready and eager to share. So let me introduce him. I'm going to send his camera.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm about to share the presentation for today. Can you confirm that you guys see it all right?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone who's taking the time to attend today's workshop. Thank you, Abdel, and thank you to SM and University of Dayton Publishing for giving me the opportunity to share with all of you today. As you very kindly introduced us, we are going to be speaking today about online assessment. This is a topic that many teachers in Mexico and pretty much all around the world is moving teachers. A lot of us have had to transfer our classes to an online setting. Some of us maybe had a platform at our school and were using it, sparingly sometimes for some things, but weren't using it full time. Others perhaps had a little bit more experience, but would like to have more of a strategy of how to use it effectively. And that's exactly what we're going to be speaking about today. Assessment in general is a very vital topic. It's something that's involved a lot of educators in the past couple of decades. And I think it is essential nowadays that teachers have a solid foundation in the philosophy and strategies of assessment. And even if you're teaching online, it is no exception. So today we're going to be addressing perhaps, hopefully, some of your concerns. We're going to be sharing tips, and we're going to be equipping you to succeed in assessing online. So our goals for today, let's get to it. Our first goal is to identify what are the best approaches, strategies, and tools for assessing students while they're learning online. So we're going to look at what it is that we should be doing in case we're not, and then if we are, how to do it well. Then the next goal is to gain practical insights, some practical ideas, how to make the best assessment decisions while we're teaching online courses. And we're going to identify best practices and media for feedback. That's going to be the latter part of our workshop, talking about feedback. So hopefully any of these three will resonate with you wherever you are, whether you're a beginning teacher or you have some experience before, but mainly in the classroom, or whether you are already experienced as an online teacher, but would like to reflect and improve. Hopefully these goals will suit your practice. Some instructions for today. These are some things that I would like you to keep in mind so we can make this a more interactive activity. The first is that there is a companion website. If you have taken a workshop with me before, I'd like to do these. The website contains access to the materials that you're looking at today, some of the activities that I will be sharing with you, references to bibliography, and a little bit about me so we can stay in touch. We're also going to be doing some visualization. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes now and then. And this is especially because reflection is something that happens when you look inside, and it works well if we're not looking at the screen for a second, but we're rather closing your eyes. This is optional, but it's highly recommended. I will also be recommending that you take notes. Staying actively on top of what's going on in the screen and in your headphones is very important, but also doing something with your hands is going to help you stay engaged. And there will be times also where I will ask you to chat, to add your contributions, your experiences, ideas, questions, comments in the chat, and that will be indicated for you, and I'll make a pause for that. So before we start, let's get that pen and paper. If you already don't have it by your side, maybe a glass of water, a nice beverage that you have around, coffee. I don't know if it's time for coffee. It's always time for coffee for me. But if you have something to drink, that's also going to help you stay awake and attentive. And if you already have your notes, I would like to suggest this way of making the notes. You divide your paper into four. There's going to be 4 sections that I would like you to make notes about. Of course, the bottom part is the main ideas and the notes. So you can do this kind of like Cornell style, maybe a column that has the main ideas, the titles, and then a column that has the notes, any additional information that you think is important. But then the 2 parts on top are the interesting part. I'd like you to have a section of your notes that's going to be called the mirror. The mirror is basically for you to write things that have to do with your own self-reflection. I would like you to put those in a special place because these are going to be important for you to look at after we are done with the workshop. The mirror is basically where you're going to look at your own practice. Where are you? What are you doing? How you are doing it? And then also for you to compare your experience with the experience of your learners. Anything that might resonate with what's happening with your learners that I mentioned in this workshop, I would like you to make a note of that in your mirror because that's going to be important for you to make the most of this workshop for your own classroom. Then there's also the refrigerator. The fridge is things that you might want to ask questions about later. I'm going to make sure to leave some time at the end for you to ask questions. Also, any ideas that you think are useful, which are interesting, that you would like to go back to later on, maybe look at the links that are on the website for you to find out more, and things to research later. So the mirror, the fridge, and then your main ideas section, you can divide your paper to make notes, and this will be a way that your notes are not only useful, but organized, and you can use them later for your own practice. Some useful terms, some vocabulary that we're going to be using today. Like I said, I don't know how many of you are already experienced in online teaching. So we will be using the word LMS. It's going to come up every once in a while. There are many alternatives for LMSs. Some of them are free, for example, Google Classroom. Some of them have been around for quite a while, like Moodle, or if you're in a school in Mexico, perhaps Educamos, Algebraics, Edmodo, Blackboard, Canvas, WebCT. There's a lot of alternatives, but the LMS is basically the learning management system. It's that platform. Teachers and students often refer to it as the platform where we post things, where we stay on top. There's usually a messaging component. We can put up grades on there. The LMS is basically your platform for doing everything that's online teaching related. I'm also going to be referring to a lot of Google tools today, G Suite, Google Docs. These are all parts of your Google account. So if you already have a Google account, you have access to a ton of educational tools that are completely free, that are widely useful for your students, and that are actually very constructive in terms of collaboration and in terms of accountability from your students. And we're going to be discussing how we can make the most of that. There's our companion website. Abdel is going to help me post this to your chat, to the chat today. This is the website in which you're going to find all of the handouts, the slides for today, the links to the tools that I'm going to be mentioning, an activity. There's going to be a video that I'm going to ask you to watch for a little bit, and the link is there. There's my contact information. There's the survey that you have to fill at the end of today's workshop for you to get your certificate. Everything is on there. So if you want to go ahead and take a moment to either copy the address and access it from your computer or a different device, or going to the chat and make sure that you have that open as we go about in our workshop. This is going to be very useful to you. And I think this is a good practice. If you ever have to teach a class online like this one, where you only have a few hours with people, having everything accessible for them from their own device is a good idea. Rather than having them download things separately. If you don't have an LMS, this is a good alternative. Having a companion website. All right, so let's get on it. So Abdel, is the address on the chat?
Yes, Isaac, that's right.
Okay, perfect. Let's carry on then. So let's begin by thinking about what assessment means. This is very important. Online teaching and teaching aren't all that different at the center. Similarly, assessment and online assessment aren't very different when we think about it from a philosophical and from the core, the essence principles of what it means. And I would like you to think about what assessment means, and I like to put it in this way. If we think about education as a conversation, this is a conversation where we have something to say as teachers. There are things that we want our students to learn, things that we want them, to share with them. Conversations don't work if we are not listening as well. And so assessment is the same as listening to the other person is in a conversation. This is very, very critical, that we understand that we cannot have a conversation with people if we are only talking. If we are not listening, then this is not really a conversation. It's a monologue, it's a spectacle, it's something else. For education to actually happen, for teaching and learning to be successful, education has to be a conversation where listening is happening at the same time as there is information sharing or talking. So let's go a little bit deeper into this metaphor. So if education is a conversation, it has two sides. There's the teacher and the learner, what the teacher has to say, what the learner has to say, and what happens in the middle. It usually begins when the teacher performs some kind of diagnostic assessment. It can be formal or informal, but basically it involves having a sense for where the students are. We begin our planning by listening to the students, whether we're looking at last year's results, whether we are considering what kind of students we have. We know them from last year. The teacher from the past year tells us, where they are. We have some information from our coordinator about who these students are. We listen first. We want to know what kind of a conversation we're going to be walking into, and we do listening even before we do any talking. Then we plan learning and we communicate these objectives for the learning. This is sort of like the talking. The teacher says, okay, so this is where we want to go. These are our objectives today. And it's very important that teachers make these objectives evident. It is part of assessment that we communicate our objective to students. Students have to know what it is we are going for, what it is we intend to achieve, what it is they are supposed to do in order to succeed. And if we communicate this adequately, there's going to be a behavioral or attitudinal response by the students. The students are going to show us from the very beginning whether they are on board with our objectives or whether they find them perhaps frustrating or exciting even, or it's going to be very simple or very easy from day one to see, at least for some of the students, what their response is. If we listen to that response and we facilitate learning activities and we conduct formative assessments that respond to everything that we're listening to from the students, then we have a conversation actually going on. Learning activities have to lead to formative assessments. Formative assessments give us information that let us create more learning activities that are tailored to the needs of students and tailored to the objectives. And there's a conversation going on, this back and forth where we facilitate learning either by directly teaching or by creating activities where we are assessing. We are listening to what the student is, how the students are responding. The learning that they are demonstrating is something that we are listening to continually as we think about assessment for learning. And finally, once our course is done, there's going to be a final tally, a final count. How much have our students learned? And that moment is actually listening again. We have that final exam, that final project, that final result. And that summative assessment is basically us listening to the student demonstrate what it is they have learned. So if you notice, there's a lot more listening in good teaching than there is talking. There is listening at the beginning, there's listening at the end, there's listening in the middle. If we are being good assessors, as we are good teachers, then we will be listening a lot, and we will be considering exams and projects and assessments not as something that the students have to do because it's a requirement, not because the workbook or the textbook tells us that they need to do it, but because this is a chance for us to listen. Are they learning? So before we embark in the actual content of today's workshop, I'd like you to take a moment to look in the mirror. That segment of your notes in which you're going to write in the mirror, I'd like you to have it ready. But beforehand, I'd like to ask you some questions. Improving online assessment begins with recognizing the way that you normally practice assessment. So I'd like you to think about it for a moment. And if you'd like, close your eyes now. Take a deep breath. And I want you to think about your teaching, your students. Try to visualize some of their faces. Try to think about a regular day in the classroom. What is happening? You know, what your work is like. Do you usually start the day with a smile? Do you end the day with a smile as well? Think about what it is you do when you walk into the classroom. Do you stand up and start talking right away? Do you hang out a little bit, listening, to see what their mood is like? Do you have a plan in your, folded neatly in your desk, or are you going to improvise this morning? Now, think about these aspects of your practice and consider the following questions. Keep your eyes closed if you are closing them. Do you actively plan for moments of assessment in each of your lessons and units? Are you, when you walk into the classroom, you have your lesson plan? Are you thinking about when it is you are going to listen to the students' learning? Is this something that you planned for? Or are you just following the lesson plan perhaps that somebody gave you, or that the textbook suggests? Or is there an active plan for assessment in your lesson? Do you know when it is that you're going to know whether the students learn? Give a moment to think about this question. All right. A second question would be, are you assessing purposefully, or are you just following the lesson plan or the textbook sequence? When you are doing an assessment in your class, for example, I'm going to give him an exercise, a practice exercise of some language that I taught today. Is that assessment on purpose? Do you realize that this is something that you're doing for them to show you that they understood? Or are you just following the steps? And finally, the third question. Do you know what you're going to do with the information that you get from the assessment? And what I mean here from the information is, so you did your exercise, your practice exercise, and you are going through the classroom, you're looking at students, monitoring their progress, and you're seeing that, some of them are doing adequately, but then several of them are actually having difficulty. They don't know what to write in the exercise. So this is information for you. 3/4 of your students aren't making progress in the exercise. What do you do with this information? Let's say that you have a test and you see that there's a distribution. Half of your students did reasonably well and the other half is very much behind. What do you do with that information? Do you have a plan for what happens if most of your students get a 6 or a 7? Or is this just something that you accept as, this is the nature of the game and sorry for them, they didn't learn, they didn't apply themselves? Or is there a plan for what happens when your students are not succeeding? You can open your eyes now. This is just an exercise for you to start thinking, reflecting about how it is you do assessment. If there are any notes that you would like to make in your notes, in your mirror, in that page, you can write them down now. Maybe this is the beginning for things, areas of opportunity for you to work on. So once we have looked at the mirror, let's begin with our topic today. So we have to start thinking about what assessment means. Assessment is basically listening to students, like I said. Assessment is basically something that good teachers have to do consciously. They have a plan for when and how they're going to do assessment. And we also have to think about how do we start that plan? What is it that we are intending to achieve, and what kind of assessment we're going to do depends on that. Assessment begins with recognizing what our objectives are. And the objectives can be your lesson objectives, your objectives can be your unit objectives, your course objectives, but these objectives are basically the beginning of any assessment. The assessment for the lesson, the assessment for the course, the assessment for the unit, it has to match those objectives. So if our objective is, for example, I have some language objective, I have to do an assessment that measures that language. And I'm going to talk about what that means specifically. So a lot of our goals in language teaching, as teachers of English, which I assume most of the people watching today are, a lot of our goals depend on two areas of competency. So one of them is competency in language skills. A lot of our programs, if you are a user of University of Dayton Publishing books, a lot of our programs, for example, begin with a reading. And so the goal, there usually is a reading goal, a goal for students to practice reading a specific kind of text, reading for specific kind of information, reading to identify the usage of a specific type of language. But there is practice of skills, reading, listening, speaking, writing. And then there's also objectives that have to do with language systems, language systems like grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, we can also call it phonology, functional language. Depending on the type of textbook that you are using or the type of course that you are teaching, your goals usually have to do with one of these two. Your students are going to practice and develop their skills, or they are meant to acquire and refine their command of specific language systems. These are two of the objectives that we have. So basically, if you go into the index section of your textbook, you're going to find one of these. You're going to find some version of skills objectives and systems objectives. But then there are other kinds of objectives, especially nowadays as we go further into bilingual teaching, as demands on our students become more extensive. A lot of English teachers are being asked to work towards goals that aren't necessarily linguistic. Some of our objectives in some of our programs have to do with other things. For example, if a lot of programs nowadays, if you are teaching in the national system, the Mexican national system, they will ask you to think about language social practices. So in addition to students practicing their reading and their listening and their grammar, the students have to understand that language occurs in a social setting, and they have to understand that those social settings give shape to the way the language is used. So some of our goals have to do with the social practices of language. Other programs can involve, for example, if they are CLIL programs, they will involve goals that have to do with content or with inquiry. For example, having students ask deep questions about the world, or if you're in the International Baccalaureate, for example, as I am, the students are learning about the world by asking questions. And part of my goal is for students to ask deep questions and recognize how to answer them. If some programs, for example, incorporate project-based learning, which has its own goals. So our objectives, in addition to skills and systems, also involve project-based learning, or PBL. And some programs are also focused on academic language or literacy. And this goes beyond simply, learning the grammar, but also learning, what kind of vocabulary do I need to answer, correctly in the TOEFL test or in the IELTS, or maybe I want to expand my understanding of literature or different kinds of text for a profession. These would be literacies and academic language objectives that I have in addition to my regular objectives. And I have to balance those. So my language objectives and my non-language objectives have to be balanced and displayed both in my lesson plan, but also in my assessment. If I have a plan for it, if I have an objective, I have to evaluate it. I have to assess it. So we're going to start by thinking about what it means to be assessing both of these things. Our first golden term of today is going to be performance assessment. So if I'm teaching English, for example, to second graders, second grade in elementary school, and I know that I have goals for them in reading. My goal is for them to read what? My goal is for them to be able to read and understand what they are reading in a very short text with a lot of drawings, with very short sentences, with very familiar words. But that is my goal. My goal is that the students are able to perform this. That's my performance assessment. So performance assessments is basically the golden standard of what it means for students to achieve the objectives. And usually it is the first assessment that we have to think about. So at the beginning of the year, I'm sitting down, I'm going to plan my unit, or I'm about to start a new bimester or a new trimester, and I need to plan my lesson, my unit. The first thing that we should be doing after we set the goals is think about what is my final exam, my final evaluation going to look like. And hopefully this final evaluation is going to be a performance assessment. So what kind of performance assessments are you doing? So like I said, if we are thinking about performance assessment, for example, if we're going to be training Olympic runners, our performance assessment is a race because we're training them to run. So, and we have to show we have to show our student, our Olympic running student, how fast we want them to run, how much time we want them to run in a single lap, what kind of pacing we want them to do. Do we want them to start slow and then go faster, or maybe start fast and then slow down at some points? How do I want to pace the race? What kind of form do I want them to hold? And are they holding them constantly? These are what I call my performance standards. How often are you hydrating? How good are you warming up? For how long? In what way? All of these things should be in the final exam, so to speak. I have to know what is my final exam. So at this moment, I'd like to hear from you in the chat. What kind of performance assessments are you doing in your teaching? What do you think is the performance assessment that I do when I teach? I'd like to hear from you. So I'm going to go to the chat now and hold for your answers a little bit. Okay. So, for example, very good. Yadira is saying that her performance assessment is a role play conversation. And this is an excellent performance assessment, because in a conversation, we can actually see the students, selecting the vocabulary. We can see them choosing, some strategies for taking turns. We see them listening to the other person. They understand what the other person is saying, and they formulate a response. And this is very authentic kind of training, authentic kind of language use. So this is very much a performance assessment. So perhaps, Yadira is using a rubric to evaluate, are they being fluent and accurate in their language use? Are they using conversation strategies? Are they being, creative in their choices, for the role? So very much. Thank you very much, Yadira, for your contribution. Are there any others that you can think of? Any other performance assessments that we do in our teaching? See? Okay. Some people say short dialogues, very much like role-playing. A short comic, yes. So for example, projects like comics allow students to choose the language that they're going to use, choose a situation in which language is supposed to be used correctly. It allows for them to personalize the story so they can get more creative and more involved in the activity. Performing sketches can also be a good performance assessment. So definitely, those are all very good suggestions. Role plays, watching a video. Okay, Faye is saying watching a video. I would have to see what it is you're expecting them to do with that video. For example, if they take the video and they give you their opinion about it, then that would be a performance assessment because I can see them respond to something. The thing about performance assessment is that we have to be able to observe it. If it is something that we can observe, then we can actually assess that, we can evaluate that. Games, competitions among groups. Yes, games can be performance assessment, but we have to be careful about, are they being authentic? Are the games something that represents our objective at the end of the course? Because the thing about games is that games often involve supports and they involve unrealistic expectations because that is what makes them competitive, you know. So the thing about a game is that sometimes games are not necessarily reflective of reality. Dialogues, real conversations, presentations. Raul says presentations, these are very good. Presentations let us see, for example, the students choosing language as well. They let us see content knowledge. They let us see research, especially if we complement a presentation, for example, with planning documents that the students turn in, and we can see what the student did in their planning document. That allows us to evaluate much more than just the language use. Reading workshops, acting with short dialogues, acting a short story, writing projects, debates. Debates are excellent. I very much love debates. Team projects, very good. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the presentation now. Thank you very much for all these wonderful suggestions about performance assessments that you do. So I know that you already do these in the classroom. Now, what about online? I mean, this is a workshop about online assessment at the end. So what can we do then? Fortunately, the good news is that everything that you do in the classroom can be done online in different ways. With some adjustments and with some, you know, usage of different tools, we can do this online. So performance assessments, like I said, you know, just to finish up this topic, they include things like, for example, competency and proficiency exams. I was very surprised that none of you said exams, but I'm very happy as well because exams aren't always the best assessment. They can be good, but not always. And it's very hard to make a good exam that's an assessment. Oftentimes, we recommend that exams are not the only assessments, that exams are completed, you know, in their assessment with projects and with other things. But we can make an exam that's reasonable as an assessment. And especially, for example, many systems, many educational systems require us to have some kind of exam. So if we're going to make an exam, there are ways to make it better. And that's why I added the fridge icon to the right of that idea, because we're going to go back to that one. How can I make an exam that's a good assessment? Then there's also integrated tasks. Some of them you mentioned, you know, debates, presentation, writing tasks. And in these, we can see, for example, that, you know, that the students are using the skills fluently, accurately, that they're using a diversity of language. You know, they have a broad vocabulary, that communication strategies are being enacted. And what I mean by integrated skills is that students are using several skills. For example, if we're going to have a debate, before the debate, the student reads something, or before they you know, they speak, they write it down first. So we have many skills going into a single task. And then, like one of you mentioned, at least, there's also project-based assessments. So projects, you know, they involve a lot of steps. They can finish with a presentation, but there's a lot of work that goes beforehand. If you're using project-based learning, a project-based assessment allows you to evaluate not only the use of language, but also things like teamwork, like knowledge of the content, like strategies to solve problems, research skills, their ability to use specific resources, in addition to the presentation and the language. Online, there are a lot of things that we can do to do performance assessment. So for example, if we're going to hold an exam, there are many platforms online that allow us to do this. So for example, we have a lot of LMSs that have exam tools. Google Forms is a great tool to make exams. If you don't know how to do it, the companion website has a link to a tutorial on how to do that. Kahoot is a great resource in your classroom. Probably many of you have tried it before. And Kahoot has an individual challenge mode now, which allows you to assign the Kahoot as a kind of quiz that the students can take in their own time, but still compete with others in a differentiated way. Socrative is another tool that lets us administrate tests. Nearpod, Quizlet, Edpuzzle. Edpuzzle is great because the exam can contain videos that way as well. There's also integrated skills tasks that can be done online through tools like video chat, like YouTube, WhatsApp voice messages, Powtoon, for example. Debates can also be held. Discussion forums, especially for the older students, are very useful. But there's also things like Flipgrid, for example. Workplace is a tool by Facebook. There's a link to that in our companion website. Twitter, Google Docs are good tools, for example, for writing tasks. Project-based assessments also incorporate several online tools that we can use for those kinds of projects. Things like Google Docs, Padlet, Google Forms, Classroom, Discord, Prezi, YouTube, Powtoon. The slides, by the way, you can download, you can access the slides through our website as well. So don't worry if you miss any of this. You don't need to make a note of every single tool that we are mentioning here. But you can actually take the time later to explore them on your own. There are links in the website to each of these. So we have solved this problem. Anything that we do in the classroom, we can do online. So now we have to think about how it is that we use it. So I would like you to think about planning for assessment by thinking about the model that we're looking at in your screen. So formative, we have to think about what our performance standard is. The performance standard is the goal, that circle in yellow that you see there. So that performance standards means that final performance evaluation that you're going to do, that role play, that project, that dialogue, that role play. That final performance standard should involve things, for example, that include knowledge, for example, about the language, skill, the usage of speaking, writing, reading, but also understanding. And especially if you have goals that are non-linguistic, that are non-language related, understanding is very important. But in order to get there, I need to go through a specific path. And that involves my lesson plan, my learning activities, the things that I'm going to teach directly, my formative assessments that's going to help me learn, from my students' performance. That is the path that I have to follow. And that formative assessment is going to tell me what road should I take? What kind of differentiation do I need to make? What adjustments I need to make to my plan, so that all together, the students and me as a teacher can get to them achieving those performance standards in that final evaluation. So let's take an example. I'm going to skip a little bit and we're going to go back to that one. Let's think about a tool. I don't know, many of you perhaps have seen Flipgrid thus far. Some of you have, some of you haven't. Flipgrid is a great tool that is sort of like a forum. It allows for you to post a video and the students can respond to that. They can respond to each other. I would like for you right now, I'm going to do it on your screen, but if you want to do it on the website, you can do it as well. Let's do the activity that the slide presents. Let's go on the website and find an example of how Flipgrid works. If you can please mute the video so you can continue to listen to me, that's going to help us carry on the activity in a better way. And of course, you can always go back to the website and look at the example on Flipgrid. So I'm going to share now how Flipgrid works, just so you can see a short example. I'm going to open Flipgrid on here. So this is Flipgrid. As you can see, it is compatible with a lot of devices. You can use a tablet, you can use a phone, you can use a computer. The students, what it does is basically the students record short videos and they respond to whatever prompt you give them. So for example, you show them a video or a short reading or a story, and then the students give you their reaction. This is especially good if your students are already producing. For example, if they're 4th grade, 5th grade, perhaps A1, advanced or A2 level students can actually start using Flipgrid. And what it does is I create my own video or my own prompt for them to respond to. And what the students do is they record themselves, and they are able to record or for others. I'm going to skip the video a little bit, and you can see that in the Flipgrid that they have here, the students are basically responding themselves. They add their own response. This is what I think. This is how I feel. This is my own response. And especially at this time, when your students aren't able to see each other's faces, Flipgrid is a great tool for them to hear each other's voices, to see each other again, to cultivate those relationships in a way that's engaging for them, that is accessible for them, and that also lets you evaluate their learning. If you see in the video here, for example, the student is showing their work and explaining what they did, this would be a great assignment for you to do with your students, where you can see what they did, but also listen to their own process, them talking about how they did it. All right, so that's enough. Flipgrid, as you can see, is a great tool that we can use for online assessment. So let's imagine for a second that we are going to do a performance assessment that's based on Flipgrid. Our students are going to be looking at art. We're going to be looking at paintings from around the world, and we have several objectives that we're going to measure with that final Flipgrid activity. There are language objectives. For example, we're going to be studying adjectives to describe art. We're going to be looking at expressions to give opinions. Things like, in my opinion, or I felt this way, or in my humble opinion. Expressions to agree or disagree. While I agree with what so-and-so said, but I think, or in my opinion, I think this, I disagree with so-and-so. There are also grammar objectives. So my objectives involves past tense questions. What these objectives mean are that when I'm evaluating the Flipgrid, I'm going to be looking at how well my students are able to use this. Do they know the adjectives? Are they using them correctly? Are they able to incorporate the expressions? Do they use the grammar in an accurate way? These objectives are going to be measured through my Flipgrid activity. I also have goals for the skills. The students should be able to read and understand the text that describe the painting and the background, who's the painter, where they painted it, what they were talking about, some of the history of the painting maybe. So they need to be able to understand these kinds of texts. That's my objective. There's also writing. The students can write the students are going to be able to write a short outline for the video. I don't just expect them to show me the video. I want to see their process. So they're going to write down some of the sentences, some of the activities, the ideas. This is going to be also kind of like a script that's going to help them make their video. So that also is formative assessment for them, because I can give them feedback and I can tell them, oh, watch out for this, this verb tense here, or maybe, oh, be careful with the structure. So my writing is also a goal that I'm going to measure in the Flipgrid video. And then there's also speaking or listening as a skill. The students can describe a painting, they can ask for others' opinions, they can agree and disagree with others. I can see that they understood their classmates and they can respond to them in speaking. So, and I finally have understanding goals. I have this, maybe I'm using a kind of program that requires me to use inquiry questions. So the students are going to ask and respond these questions. How does art reflect a personal vision of the world? And how can we relate to works of art on a personal level? I'm going to evaluate this as well. I want to see the students connecting to the artwork on a personal level and showing me how they achieve that. And I also want them to tell me how it is that they see the personal vision of the artist in the painting. So all of these can be measured through that Flipgrid activity. I'm going to be evaluating it. And so my activity is going to be the goal. That is, the Flipgrid about art is my final performance assessment. This is going to happen at the end of the month or at the end of my semester, however often you have class. But this is sort of like the end of the road. When we are done with this unit, my students will be able to achieve all those wonderful objectives that I set for them, because that is the goal that I'm going to evaluate at the end. But along the road, we're going to be using a lot of activities. We're going to be using some direct teaching. So for example, I'm going to use a tool called Edpuzzle to show them some videos with expressions to exchange opinions. And they're going to use that activity as a way for them to see how the opinions are used. They're going to, use those examples as a, as a practice kind of activity. Maybe they're going to make their own version of the dialogue that they saw in the video at the end. There's also going to be learning activities like vocabulary, which is a tool that lets you make vocabulary games. There's also going to be a Socrative race that asks students to practice their grammar. And maybe we're going to have a video chat lesson where I'm going to show them paintings and we're going to practice some of the activities. And then there's also going to be formative assessments. There's going to be activities in which I can evaluate how well the students dominate language. So we're going to do a Kahoot challenge for that. I'm going to ask them to record voice notes with opinion phrases to make a dialogue. And then I'm going to do an outline for the video that they're going to record in the Flipgrid. That's going to be a formative assessment. Let's be very clear that what I mean by formative assessment here is that the students are going to have a chance to do this more than once. The students are going to be able to access this activity more than one time for them to perform better and better each time until they feel ready. Based on that information, I see that a lot of them are doing well on the Kahoot, but perhaps their voice notes weren't very good. That's going to lead me to decisions. So maybe I'm going to do reinforcements activities for some of them. I'm going to do some direct teaching on video chat because I need them to reinforce those topics that I wasn't so sure about. And that's going to take me to my final goal. My Flipgrid about art is going to help the students demonstrate what they learned through an actual performance assessment that was completed, through all of these other formative assessments and learning activities that I did using online tools. So as you can see, if we have a very good performance assessment, that's going to show us more or less where we want to go. And from there, my task as a teacher, my big challenge is to use the tools. So how do I choose what tools I'm going to use? And I want you to think about, this as a kind of pyramid. So what kind of tools do I have to use? Of course, your first priority should be the learning. What are my learning goals and what do I want them to demonstrate? If my objectives have to do with speaking and reading, of course, my performance assessment has to include speaking and reading. But I also have to think about my own teaching. So maybe I'm going to give Flipgrid a try, but I would recommend that you maybe go slow, little by little, whenever you're going to take a new tool. Or for example, if you're going to do Flipgrid, but you have 200 students to assess, that means that you're going to have to watch 200 videos that are about 3 minutes long, and that's going to consume a lot of your time, and that's going to be a huge workload for you. So you have to think about whether that's compatible with your work. Also, if you're going to give them a new tool, is this a tool that you can give your students support about? Can you actually help your students along the way? These are some considerations. If I don't know how to give students support on Flipgrid, maybe I need to take it slow, learn a little better, do a little bit of practice, maybe not make this a huge assessment. Maybe it can be just like a practice activity that I do in a lesson or two, and that lets me get some practice myself before I do a performance assessment on Flipgrid. I also have to think about software. Is the software that I'm going to be using accessible? Is this something, for example, that my students can access on their phone? If I have students that are only able to access a mobile phone for their online activities? Is this a platform, for example, that lets the student do the kind of thing that I asked them to do? If my goal is speaking, does the platform allow the students to speak, to record? Is this compatible with the software that I'm using for example, my LMS? Is it easy to use? Do the students know it? Sometimes it might be better to go with a tool that the students already know, rather than saturate them with new tools that the students don't really know or that are not that easy to use. And finally, of course, I also have to think about hardware considerations. So if I'm going to be using an online tool that is very novel, it has augmented reality and so on, but then my computer is very old, that might give me some headaches. So it's important to think about, is the hardware that I have capable? So I have to think about, is this something that I can use? Is this something that is accessible? Is this hardware that I have capable? So my advice is, please, before you try a new tool, think about these levels of ideas. Think about, Guess what are your learning goals, but also think about, is this compatible with your workload? Is this something that you can support your students with? Is this compatible with the software that the students know and already use? So if you're going to use Flipgrid, make those considerations as well. So now let's assume, for example, that I have a very mean coordinator and she doesn't let me use the Flipgrid as my only assessment. So she asks me to have an exam. What can I do? If I'm going to do an assessment, that's an exam. Now, exams aren't really performance-based by their own nature, unless they are intended to measure competency. So we're going to talk about exams now. How can I make it so that my exams are not simply, the students answering multiple choice questions and demonstrating their ability to do ini, mini, mini, mo? Here are some ideas. If I'm going to do an exam, my first piece of advice is make sure that the multiple choice items require understanding. So for example, if I'm going to ask them to read a text, ask not only general questions about the global understanding of the text, but also refer the students to specific paragraphs. Tell them, what does this phrase in this paragraph mean, for example? Or focus on aspects of language that aren't literal. So for example, what does the phrase on this context specifically mean? So make sure that the multiple choice items aren't just about ini, mini, mini, mo, or that they couldn't be deciphered just by random chance or by a keyword. Make sure that it requires very specific understanding of the context. Make sure that your exam involves the authentic use of skills. So if you're going to do a reading test, make sure that the students are reading a text that is realistic in length and in complexity. If the students are going to be listening, make sure that the listening occurs in situations that are authentic. They get to listen to it once or twice, but no more than that. Make sure that the students get questions and tasks that are familiar to them. If the exam has an exercise that they've never done before, or that it's an exercise that requires them to hurry a lot, that isn't, they have to figure out the exercise in addition to the actual content, they're going to be very stressed. So this is not going to be a very realistic assessment of their ability. So make sure that your online test is familiar to them. This is something that they sort of know how to do in terms of mechanics. Also make sure that they understand the criteria for the assessment, what it is that you're going to look for. So if you're going to do open questions, for example, make sure that they understand what you're going to look for in the open question. So tell them, I want to look for this kind of vocabulary. I want to see that you use this kind of grammar properly. And also make sure that the conditions to taking the test are authentic, adequate, and appropriate. So don't hurry them a lot. Make sure that the test is adequate to their needs, that this is something that they can do in the time that they have, that the questions aren't crazy difficult, that it is adequate for them to show you that they learned, but no more than that. And if you're going to do your test online, there are many recommendations that we can take into account. So my first tip is that your best friend is the learning management system. Whatever learning management system you're using probably already has some kind of feature that allows you to do tests. So rely on that first. Once you do that, figure out how can you program the time. Make sure that the students are able to access the assignment once it's open and once it is closed. If you can, run a test. Tell the students that they're going to do the test for the test. Sort of like a dress rehearsal of the test, of when you're going to open the test and then close it later, so that the students can see how it works and that nobody runs into a surprise over the platform. Also, it is a good idea to have platforms that allow people to authenticate their identity. So Google Classroom, for example, or Google Drive forces the students to use a Google account. So you know that they are the ones that are answering the test. And you can even share the documents and you can see them writing it live. For example, you can see them as they're typing, which allows you to see that they are not copying and pasting from a translator, for example, or at least gives you a little bit more security that they're not. You can also use integrity check platforms. If your school is lucky to have Turnitin, use that. Or you can also use other free alternatives like Plagram, for example. Make sure that your exam integrates skills. So in addition to reading and writing, make sure that, if you can, that the students have a component where they have to listen or they have to record themselves so they can show you that they are using their skills. Also, you can do personal questions if you're doing writing and reading. Make sure that this is related not only to themselves as people, but also to the past work. And this will allow you to see that there's a relationship between what the students know and show you in the exam and what the students have done before. And also consider ask them for handwritten exams. This way you can see that it is their actual handwriting, and that they can even scan it with an app. For example, Adobe Scan is free. It's very powerful. It's very good quality scans that they can do with their phone, or there's other alternatives. So if your students have good phones and they can provide this for you, this kind of assessment, consider it an option. It is it is allowable, and if you upload the scans into Google Drive, you can actually comment on the responses and you can grade them there. I would also suggest that you sign a contract with your students on the use of translators. It is very easy to do Google Translate nowadays. So all we can do really, just like we would do in the classroom, is make sure the students understand that it is not in their benefit to use a translator, and that there might be consequences if you as a teacher choose to make them. And I think they will be reasonable to accept that, yes, the goals of an English class are not to use a translator. And when you're in doubt about the authenticity of a work, compare the past classwork to their exam or the past work to explain, have them explain to you what they wrote. So if you're doing online tests, these are recommendations that you can take. So let's get to the final part of our workshop. Let's think about feedback. Formative assessments, if we are actually doing it in a formative way, it requires us to do feedback that is useful, that is timely, and that meets the needs of learners. Quality feedback on time from the teacher makes the difference between a soulless list of computer chores and a truly positive online learning experience. If the students are just getting instructions, okay, do this, now do that, and they are not getting any actual feedback from you, they're going to feel that this is online hell rather than a learning experience. So feedback is very, very critical for them to feel like they are getting actual learning. How do I make sure of that? So first of all, we have to recognize that there are a lot of tools that we can use. Some of the tools that we can use to give feedback are automated. They exist already in the tools that we are using. So for example, Socrative has a wonderful option that allows you to do feedback. If a student gives you an incorrect answer, you can write down pre-formative feedback. So you can, tell them to look more carefully into this or that, or you can tell them this answer is incorrect because of this. Google Forms also has a form of automated feedback. It allows you to set scores for each of the grades. It allows you to choose what kind of open answers they can write and give them feedback on that. Kahoot also has some limited feedback, at least in the form of a score. And a lot of platforms and learning management systems allow you to do automated feedback. Automated feedback is going to save you a lot of work. This is something that you can put into your refrigerator. Look into how can you do automated feedback for your online assessments. But if you're going to do feedback that is personalized, there's a lot of tools that you can do that. If you're using Google Docs, for example, you can do comments on that one. There's a function for you to comment on the slides, on the Google spreadsheets, on Google Documents. I personally, for example, like to do an attendance sheet on Google Slides, on Google Spreadsheet, and that allows me to make comments on students' work for the day. Very quick, very to the point kind of feedback. Voice notes on WhatsApp or Google Drive are also a good idea. Maybe record yourself, do a voice note, upload it to Drive and share it with the students, general comments for them. And hearing your voice is actually another way for them to feel like it's a personal message. Responses to online discussions, if the students you ask the students to participate in a discussion, make sure that you're participating as well, that you are responding to their ideas, praising them, but also giving them ideas on how to improve, giving them an impression of how they're doing. Private messages, if you're using a platform, just send them a message, every once in a while about their work. And if you're using Flipgrid or a platform similar to it, you can do a video message even, and a feedback message on Flipgrid is very valuable for students. My advice also, your best friend here, is that you can also make a comment bank. Make a document somewhere, maybe make a spreadsheet where you have comments that you can sort of take from and comment later. and make sure that these comments are based on your rubric or the assessment criteria. I guarantee that if you make this personal, it's 100% better than telling the student, oh, well, look at the rubric. These are your mistakes. If the students are told to look at the rubric, some students will do it, especially the ones that are very autonomous in their learning, but other students will not know what you mean at all if you tell them to look at the rubric, or they will not know how to interpret the message that you give them when you tell them to look at the rubric. So it's very important that you make these comments personalized as much as you can. So, and what kind of comments can I make? What should I be commenting about? Now, my rule of thumb is that your comment should not be longer than 100 words. Don't make this, don't write them the Bible, because you're going to spend a lot of time on that. And also the students aren't actually going to read. They're going to look into the first couple of lines, especially if you give them a grade along with the comment. Usually the first thing that they look at is the grade, and the only thing that actually sticks in their mind is the grade. So make sure that you give them a comment that is brief, that is constructive, and preferably not tied to a grade in an immediate way. There are many levels of feedback that you can give them. This comes from John Hattie and his theory of visible learning. And I think it's very useful because it works not only in the classroom, but also online. If I'm going to give them comments, these very short comments on their work, the most common kind of comment that I want to give them is comments on the task. How did I do? Did they match the objective, or did the students maybe made a mistake in a very critical part, and so they need to do it again? Make sure that you tell them exactly what they can improve. That don't just tell them, okay, this was bad, do it again. Make sure that you tell them what they need to review. This is very important. If the students are engaged, they're going to ask you for it. And if they're not engaged, it's all the more important that you actually reach out to them and tell them how they can improve. Then, on occasion, every once in a while, you also want to give them comments on specific steps. Oh, well, this part of your writing, make sure that, your transition sentences are according to what we saw in class. Very specific steps of the project or the process that they're doing. Aspects of the work that are not just the results, is it good or bad, but actually the process of how they got there. Another level that you want to give them is on self-regulation. This happens as needed. If you see that the student is constantly making a mistake, or a student that on the contrary is constantly succeeding and doing a lot better than others, you also want to have a dialogue with them about that. So have a conversation with them through the comments section, or maybe through a personal message on the LMS, and ask them, what goes through your mind when you're doing this? What goes through your mind when when you keep making these kinds of mistakes, for example? Or how do you feel working online? Is this enough work? Is this too much work? Make sure that you're staying on top of the student's pulse on this matter. And finally, you also want to make frequent comments, but not in an insincere way. This can be done in a formal or informal way about the students themselves. Let students know that you value them, that their needs are important to you, that you value their effort, and that you want them to grow. This is very important, especially if your students already have some kind of classroom rapport. These are students that you have seen before, and you want them to know that you still care for them and that you still care about their learning. It's important that you not only ask them about the work itself, but that you also ask them about them. How are they doing? So if I'm going to give feedback to my students, make sure that you are addressing the different levels. And I'd like you to very quickly look at the levels that you have on your screen and consider, is this feedback that you are giving to your students enough? All right. So I think we have finished a little bit early. I wanted to plan for us to have time for questions and answers. So I planned for us to get time for that, and we're going to go into that a little bit right now. But I want us to go back to the goals of today. This is a practice that I try to implement in every class that I teach. And I want you to, just think mentally, and whether we have reached them and to what extent, how much have we reached them? The first goal today was, do you have the best approaches, strategies, and tools for assessing students learning online? I know that an hour or an hour and a half isn't necessarily enough for us to get there, but I hope that you got a sense for how many different kinds of tools you can use. And I hope you had an idea of how you can start implementing assessment online. How can you start planning for that performance assessment that is fed through through learning activities and through formative assessments. I also wanted you to gain practical insights. So how can you make assessment decisions? So I want you to think about that pyramid that we saw, and hopefully you have started thinking about these ideas yourself. Are these tools that I want to try? How many tools do I want to try at a time? Which tool is more convenient for me according to my students' abilities, my students' needs, and also my own work? Is this compatible with my work and my hardware and my software? And finally, my third goal was for you to identify best practices and media for students' feedback. So I hope that the levels of feedback that you get from John Hattie allow you to think about what kind of feedback might be useful and meaningful for your students. Also that the different platforms that I gave you, different suggestions that I gave you for feedback are, allow it to make it efficient for you. So at this time, I'd like you to, let's go to the chat. We're going to get to the questions and comments now, and we're going to get a good amount of time for us to answer your questions. So I'm going to go to the chat and have a look at, I'm going to stay posted in case you have any questions before we go into the rest of our presentation. I mean, our strategies. So let's see, activities. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to look at your questions. Okay, so here's a question from Emmy from Cancun. What do you think about exams? Do they have to be easy or hard? That is an excellent question. There are some practical insights that we can think about. If you are familiar with the idea of the zone of proximal development, I think this is a very good rule of thumb. So you want to make the exam, if your students are here, the exam should be here. Not too high above. If you put the exam here, that's going to demotivate the students and that's going to give you very poor results. But if the students are here and you give them the exam on this level, the students are not going to grow from that. That's just going to be, taking time, and it's going to feel like busy work. So definitely try to make the exam challenging for them, but not too challenging. And then my other advice is that your exams are something that the students already know is challenging for them. Make sure that you don't surprise them, with these kinds of like aha questions that, this is a very difficult text that you don't know how to answer. That's just going to play tricks with their minds. And I'm not sure that's very conducive to learning. So make sure that your exams are an authentic demonstration of what your students' skills are, but that they are just a smidge above their current level, so that they are a challenge for them, and that motivates them to keep growing, and that the feedback that you give them also relates to the kinds of mistakes they make. Now, I don't want an exam where I know all my students are going to get 5s, but I also don't want an exam where all my students are going to get 10s. I want an exam that's actually going to be, that allow me to give them feedback on things they can improve. Eugenia from Ecuador is asking us, what assessment do you recommend to use for children? This depends on the age. Thank you very much for that question. It is very important. So when you're working with children, and I think many teachers that are working with small students, with younger students, are recognizing that a big amount of what we're doing is working with the parents. The parents have to be sort of next to us. And the kind of assessment that we can have has to do with the kind of responses that the students are going to show us. So my recommendation is that you use assessment that is based on understanding for the students. Not so much production, but that the students show us that they understand what you are talking about. So for example, exams that have to do with visuals, showing them big pictures, or very short, very to the point kinds of videos that they can respond with a nod or a smile, or them telling you their personal favorite, or reproducing, imitating what you ask them to give you. Those kinds of evaluations are going to be very useful. In terms of small children, I think that we need to do a lot more synchronous kind of evaluation than we would with older students. With these kinds of younger students, younger learners, we're going to have to do a lot of evaluation through video chat, if that is possible. Or if video chat is cumbersome, maybe we can use a tool like Flipgrid, but have the parents help you out. So they have to be very concise instructions. They have to be very much about having them understand and respond in a way that is natural for them. So nonverbal language, choices, imitation, that's how students show you their learning at that age. They're not necessarily going to be able to write or produce in an authentic and independent way, but they can very much respond and they can very much show you that they understand language. And that should be your performance assessment with those students. Maybe having them show you that they understand a specific video by telling you their favorite, or by showing you, that they can do the motion that the character makes, something like that. So that kind of objectives that are very much tailored to the adequate level of the student is the kind of assessment that you want to do for very young children. Felix Dominguez, in a related questions, is asking us to about music. I think music is a great tool for us to assess younger learners. For example, if we have a music that allows the students to respond in some way through gestures, like clapping or jumping or that kind of assessment, especially with very, very young learners, music can be very useful. In terms of the older learners, music can be a very good kind of formative activity. For example, Edpuzzle, that tool can allow you to make, for example, listening kind of activities where the students have to listen for specific words and they have to respond in the puzzle, in the quiz. But those are more like formative activities. I think when it comes to performance assessments, we have to think about whether music is an authentic application of the skill. So definitely for formative activities, there's a lot of tools that we can use. Edpuzzle, Powtoon, even video chat, we can use music, although there's going to be a delay, so it might not be as efficient as we would like. But music is a good formative activity. I think for performance assessment, music might not be the first go-to choice. Yadira Carrera is asking us, is there a tool that I recommend to create exams? Like I said, my first recommendation is that you go with your LMS. If you're using Schoology or Educamos or any platform, that would be my first choice. But if you're not having, if you don't have a go-to platform for exams, I would highly recommend that you use Google Forms. Google Forms is very, very useful, very simple, very intuitive, and it allows you to make exams that have a correct answer. So for example, if you do multiple choice, Google Forms allows you to configure which is the correct option for the students to choose. It allows you to do very specific parameters for open answers. So for example, if you have a question that is, the past tense of a specific verb, you can have the students type that, but then you as a creator of that Google form, you can set what the correct answers for that question are, and you can do a number of alternative spellings, with uppercase and lowercase, with period at the end or without a period at the end. Google Forms is very useful. It allows you to give different scores. It allows you to give feedback, automated feedback, and it also allows you to both have a preliminary grade for some questions and then also grade open answers. And when you grade the open answers, you can assign different scores and you can give personalized feedback for each of the open answers. So Google Forms, I highly, highly recommend. There's a link on the website. I'm actually going to share, to show you where that is on the website. So the website is on my presentation. I give you all the links in my website for all those tools that we mentioned today. And there's actually a link to a tutorial on how to do exams on Google Forms. There's a video, it's very simple, it's very intuitive. If you go to the links to tools that I gave you on the website, the first recommendation that I gave is Google Forms. So Google Forms is very simple. It is very intuitive, and it allows you to, if you, for example, you can open and restrict access to the form as you wish. So if you want to, for example, close the form at a certain point, you can stop accepting answers at a certain time of the day, and that allows you to stop the exam at that point. So Google Forms is a good option. Another option that I would give you is to create a Google document. So you create a Drive folder where you create that Google document and you share it with the student directly. You have a list of emails from the students before, and the students give you their response, and you can actually watch them as they type. You can actually get, you can close the document, edit the settings so that the permission for the student sort of expires at a certain time, and they can no longer edit after that time. So Google Documents is another good option for you to do exams. And if you want to go with a more automated kind of tool, Kahoot and Socrative are also good tools. My only reservation about Kahoot and Socrative is that they are restrictive about the kind of questions that work. Kahoot is very much about multiple choice. Is not really going to let you do a lot of open kind of answers. And Socrative will, but Socrative doesn't restrict the resources that students have access to. And for example, if the students use a translator or the students have other tabs open while they do the activity, you're not going to be able to control that. You can control it if you, for example, change the kinds of questions that you do, make sure that the questions are very personal, make sure that the questions have the kind of vocabulary that the students can use. But in the end, you have not a lot of control if you're going to do an exam using one of these platforms. So definitely my first go-to would be Google Forms. After that, Google Documents. And if not, any of the other platforms that I give you are very useful as well. So let me see, first graders, I think we already touched on some of the original question about young learners. Is it good to have multiple choice tests with students? Monica Revilla is asking them. The answer is no. In simple terms, no. If you're doing formative assessments, multiple choice tests are good as a formative assessment every once in a while, but you definitely don't want to do it all the time. If your students are always getting multiple choice quizzes, some bad things are going to happen. One thing that's going to happen is that the students are going to be sharing the questions with each other. Because they know what kind of questions you do, and they know that once one of them finishes, they're going to take a screenshot of that question, and they're going to send it to the others, and that's not going to be very good for you in terms of authenticity of the work and in terms of the classroom dynamic. You want to make sure that you have a good variety of research of activities. Also, multiple choice tests don't let you see what the students are doing, so definitely I would recommend that you do use multiple choice tests, but only every once in a while, and make sure that the goal that you're using the multiple choice test is compatible with the learning objective that you're going to do. Let's see, assessment for elementary school, 5 to 8 years old. Okay, at this age, and I guess this goes back to first grade as well. At this age, 5 to 8 years of age, the students are already able to produce a little bit, but the assessment that they will be able to take on is very much limited to very specific, very guided kind of production. So I would say that if your student is 6 years old, for example, writing one word is going to be a challenge for them. So you definitely want to encourage them to, for example, write things by hand and maybe send you a picture and explain it to you in a video, or maybe have the parents help them explain their work. Very guided kind of activities, the same thing we would do with younger learners, 3 or 4 years of age. We want them, give very specific instructions for very specific products, and make sure that the students and the parents understand what you want them to demonstrate. The parents are going to be a huge help for you, especially for learners that are ages 4 all the way, I think, to 8 or 9 years old. You want the parents to understand what your assessment objectives are. So I think the best assessment at this age is very limited production, as well, very limited kind of understanding. Games are very good at this age. Flashcards, kind of visually supported assessments are very good. For example, show them a video, show them a picture and ask them to, tell you about what they see in the picture by using phrases that we saw in class, adjectives that we see in class, maybe having them respond to their classmates in a very limited, very structured kind of way. And that would be the best assessment that we can do for younger learners. Otoniel Corniel asks us, what if you as a teacher don't believe in exams to assess your students? I am 100% with you. I think exams are generally not the best way to assess students. I think we can get some information from exams that is useful, and especially if our institution asks us to have exams, we sort of have to like bend our arm a little bit, you know, and accept that this is a tool that we can have. Of course, it shouldn't be the only tool. It shouldn't be it's not the best tool, like I said, to evaluate. But if you're going to do it, it's better that the exam is formative or that it is a competency-based exam. Okay, Anonymous is saying, I use slides with animation. I just put an image so that students can produce the language to check understanding. Is this correct? Yes, as long as the language that the students are being asked to produce is personal. If it is a personal response, and if it is according to the expectations that they should do at the age grade that you have. So for example, if it's a 4 or 5 year old student, you have an animation and you ask them to respond, a short phrase, a yes or no, a preference is a good expectation for assessment. If it's an older student, maybe 11, 12 years old, if the level of English is a little higher, they can produce some sentences by themselves. You definitely want to guide some of that language, but also expect them to produce something more authentic, and maybe even interact with each other. Maybe have them, you know, practice asking questions to each other about the image. Sort of what you would see in a Cambridge examination for children. That kind of activity is a good standard for the kind of assessment that you can do. Do you think it is good to test students using lots of questions? It's Monica Revilla is asking. Like, for example, if the test is scored 10, do I have to use 10 questions? Short answer is no. This is going to depend on the age of the students. And I would definitely think that grading is a topic that we didn't get into deeply, but it is very much relevant to assessment. If your grade is 10, you want to make sure that as much as you can, the 10 actually means something. So if the student got a 10 in the exam, it shouldn't only mean that the student was able to answer the questions correctly. It should be a demonstration of the student's ability. It should be hard enough that for students to get a 10, they have to be completely in fulfillment of your objectives. So you have to make sure that if the student is able to get a 10, that student not only is able to understand the reading, but is able to, you know, maybe show you that they understand, not only in the exam, but outside of the exam in a different context. So I think the number is relative. It's not just about the question. Some teachers, for example, can give different weights to different questions. So these 3 questions are heavier in the grade than these 5 questions, for example. If I'm going to ask vocabulary questions, like, you know, match the word to the meaning, I wouldn't give a lot of weight to that kind of question, because that only shows me that they are familiar with the vocabulary, but that they are very good at putting puzzles together. So I wouldn't give a lot of weight if my exam is an evaluation of language, but I would give weight, for example, to open-ended questions. You know, an open-ended question can be worth 3 points, and a multiple choice or a jumbled sentence kind of question can be worth 1 point. And this is because think about the amount of cognitive effort that it takes, and think about how authentically the question demonstrates the student's ability. If the question is for them to produce language, that is a very authentic demonstration of their ability. If the question asks them to identify language, that shows you they are familiar, but it's not very precise. It's not a very precise representation of the student's ability. Okay, Nefti from Spain is asking, how could we apply websites and apps like the ones you recommended to young learners who are not able to read and write yet? Okay, and going back to that one, the question here is, like I said, you have to think about what tool can your student use. So definitely, I would think that you want to think about apps that they can use independently. Some of the apps that are, you know, shaped like games, for example, Kahoot is something that a student that is 6, 8 years old could do, but perhaps a student in kindergarten, H is not very well able to coordinate that fast, to look at something and have 30 seconds to look at the right shape and identify it. That would be a very much a challenging kind of game for the students to play at that age. But one thing they can do at that age, for example, is ask them to identify specific letters. There are a lot of games, and one thing we can do is work in coordination with the parents to use those kinds of games, and the parents can send you a screenshot of the results. Of course, that would require you to trust the parents. Hopefully, that is something that is possible in your context. But parent involvement is something that we cannot go around, especially when we're working with younger students, both because the students' abilities are not necessarily as great, but also because safety is a huge concern and ability is a huge concern. All right, Abdel, I am seeing that we have the schedule up. Are we out of time for questions?
Yes, Isaac, you have a time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. I'm just projecting the schedule for the next 2 weeks. It's okay. Okay,
perfect. Okay, so let me keep scrolling down your questions. Okay, so one person here says we have to adapt the assessments to students' learning styles. To an extent. My response to that would be learning styles are kind of a controversial topic nowadays. People have, yes, preferences for the kinds of activities that they feel better at, but this is very much a subjective impression when you compare that to their ability to learn. At least when it comes to the cognitive science studies behind learning styles, there's not a lot of evidence that shows that students learn better when they listen to something, for example, as opposed to when they read it. But what it shows you is that some ideas, some tasks are more complicated than others. Other factors, rather than the student's preference, could be intervening there. It could be, for example, the student's anxiety levels, their prior experience with the kind of activity, their familiarity with the knowledge, their literacy, their cultural background. A lot of things have to weigh in on thinking about learning styles. Also, the age of students is very important. Like I said, for example, visual kind of activities are a lot more constructive with younger learners because they are able to respond better than they are able to produce, and they need a lot of support. It's not so much about the learning style, but about the needs of the learner. That visual support, that auditory support, that kinesthetic kind of support, it's not so much about the learning style, but it's about what the student needs to learn. The students need variety, for example, so it's not always good to have the same kind of activity. We want to give different ideas. I'm going to go back now to Ramon, who asked, is it good to make exams integrated with different kinds of skills? For example, have a reading with comprehension works, later a listening exercise and grammar and vocabulary in the same exam, or is it better to separate those assessments? That's a huge question. Thank you very much for asking it. My advice on that one is that depends on the amount of time that you have. Like I said, you have to balance that with your workload. How much can you actually assess? And also, how well can your students take that long of an exam? Think, is my student able to sit down for 2 hours in front of the computer to do, a reading, a listening, a writing? Like, that would be basically taking a TOEFL exam. So maybe my advice on that one is, you can do separate evaluations and add up the grade. Maybe do the listening examination one day and then the reading examination a different day. And of course, you can build on some of the context. For example, the listening exam can be on the same topic as the reading exam, but not the same text. You don't want to do the same text that they're reading and then having to listen to that. You want to do different texts, maybe similar vocabulary, similar context, but not the same evaluation in listening and reading. You want to separate those. Think about the needs of your student. Your student is going to have to sit down for 2 hours for a 4-skill assessment. My advice is maybe not. Unless you have university students or high school students, and this is a very critical assessment, and this is going to be a very heavy assessment in terms of their grade. I would advise that you split it up a little bit. Maybe do a listening and reading kind of test, and then a speaking and writing another day, or mix them up in different ways. But don't do it all in one time. Don't bite the whole sandwich at once. All right, I think we are out of time. Abdel, any last comments before we go?
Well, just saying thank you. We have a lot of questions. And remember that on the site Isaac created, you can get in contact with Isaac. You can send an email. He wrote his email there, so you can always send questions, comments. Thank you, Isaac, for all your good tips and the resources you share, because this is what we're looking for nowadays. On the screen, you can see our calendar for the next 2 weeks. Tomorrow we have, as usual, 12:30 Mexico time, and starting Wednesday, probably we're going to change a little bit our schedule. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you more details because most of the teachers right now are working on the schools. They are back now on the school, so maybe we're going to change a little bit the schedule so we can get to more teachers. So just be aware. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you more details, and also on our Facebook page, SM Mexico, and most of our University of Data Publishing, and most of the social nets. Thank you again, Isaac. Thank you, everyone, for watching us. Please, have a nice afternoon.
I was going to remind them, don't forget to complete the evaluation survey. There's a link on the website as well. This is so you can receive your certificate, in shortly, so that everybody that attended today gets a certificate. So before you can get it, you have to complete the evaluation. Don't forget, please.
Exactly, thank you. And also it's on the chat box. I posted several times, so you can directly click on the chat box and get access to the survey. Thank you, Isaac, again. Please, everyone, have a nice afternoon and be safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.